Much like the handsome Gorlak or the grotesque Elkbird, your average dwarf is more comfortable in the mossy depths of a cavern than in the underbrush of a forest. But there are some dwarves, possibly stricken with extreme cases of reverse cave adaptation sickness or rimworld addiction, that choose to live the majority of their lives on top of the dirt rather than below it. And while all dwarven colonies face a gauntlet of challenges on the path to stability, those on the surface have some additional unique challenges they must face along the way. The first additional challenges my dwarves faced when I started building an above-ground fortress were in woodcutting and construction. Woodcutting because we had to do a lot of it, and my dwarves seemed to think that the job of cutting down a tree was done the moment it began to fall, and so they kept getting knocked out or killed by trees they were chopping down. And construction because it went against all of the mining instincts my dwarves had built up over a childhood in the mines, and it took my dwarves months without beds to sleep on or tables to eat at to build a small settlement, the equivalent of which could be mined out of stone in a matter of weeks. But over the first couple years, we managed to mostly get over these limitations, occasional dead lumberjack aside, and once we had everything we needed inside the settlement, we moved on to a new challenge: defense. If we were underground, we could simply lock some doors, raise a bridge, and kick up our feet whenever an enemy came calling. But on the surface, things were a bit more complicated. We had built a wall out of chalk around the perimeter of our territory, and I had told my dwarves to dig out a moat around the town. But without water to protect us, any enemy with a free hand and a mountain goat's mentality could climb down one side of the moat and up the other without a problem. Typically, I would just tap into the infinite water resources of a river, or maybe a volcano if I was feeling fancy, to fill a moat around something on the surface. But in my infinite wisdom, I had chosen to embark in a patch of land with no river and no magma. Dumping the nearby stagnant ponds into the moat managed to fill up the first layer, at the cost of making the town's surroundings really ugly, but once they were dry, I was back to square one. During the whole pond draining experiment, I had known that I was probably going to need to build a pump stack, but had put it off because I had never built one before. But now, with the ponds empty and the moat virtually empty if I rounded to the nearest full moat, I knew it was time to turn the diagrams from the wiki into an actual machine in my world. An hour later, it was built, but still needed to be powered. Windmills on my map seemed to generate no power no matter how high in the sky I built them, and I obviously didn't have a river for simple water wheel power generation, and so I was forced to spend another 15 minutes turning my understanding of this diagram into a working water reactor. After a couple minutes spent filling up the reservoir of the reactor, I finally got one of my dwarfs to manually start the pump, and we were off. The moat immediately began getting filled, and the cavern drained, and so I sat back for the next 30 minutes or so and watched as the moat and the ponds that I had emptied were filled with water. With our struggles with woodcutting, construction, and defense now behind us, the town grew into a city and then a metropolis, and was promoted to a barony and then a county. The success of any fortress also comes with an increase in enemies though, and while the Forgotten Beast Fight Club down in the caverns didn't really affect us up on the surface, we had our own problems with all the other creatures of the forest. They were the elves I had killed because their diplomat insulted my dwarves, which started a war between our two civilizations. They were the goblins that unsuccessfully sieged us biannually, though they always seemed to kidnap a wandering child or two each time they came to visit. There was the Cyclops that didn't even manage to lay its eye on the prize before getting cut down by my soldiers. And then there was the dragon. With everything else, I was comfortable sending my soldiers out to fight, but a literal fire-breathing dragon seemed like it would be best left to the moat. I tried to raise the bridges before I could cross them, but that turned out not to be an issue, because it just blew them up with fireballs instead. Some dwarves were immediately vaporized by the blasts, but for the most part, my dwarves had the good sense to hide and let the dragon tire itself out. And sure enough, after a couple minutes spent wandering around being a little arsonist in the forest, the dragon decided to try to cross the moat to roast my dwarves. Unfortunately for the dragon, it sank like a stone when it landed in my moat, and apparently couldn't hold enough air in its big dragon lungs to get to the access ramp to escape. But even with the bones of a dragon resting down at the bottom of our moat, there's no such thing as being truly safe up on the surface. A rock could fly over the moat and walls and kill some dwarves before I even knew what was happening. A more buoyant dragon might make it across the moat and do a hell of a lot more damage than the first one did, or a tree might fall on and kill yet another woodcutter. There's no such thing as safety on the surface, but it is a lot of fun. Thanks for watching, an extra thank you to those of you who support me on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.